The constable arrived within 20 minutes, though it seemed to those gathered upon the lawn like far longer. Police Constable Willoughby, a man of middle years whose tenure in the village extended back nearly 2 decades, moved through the gathered guests with the measured efficiency of someone accustomed to disruption, yet still somewhat unprepared for its actual occurrence. Behind him came Dr. Carruthers, who had been asked to examine the body and confirm what Timothy's horrified discovery had already made abundantly clear. Martha Ashworth lay upon the Persian rug in her sitting room, her pale blue dress now stained with the dark evidence of violence. A heavy crystal vase, part of a matched pair that had sat upon the mantelpiece for decades, lay shattered beside her, fragments glinting in the late afternoon light like accusing eyes. The blow to her head had been severe and almost certainly immediate, the sort of injury that would have rendered her unconscious before understanding had time to register. Dr. Carruthers, kneeling beside the body with a gravity that seemed to age him further, estimated that death had occurred somewhere between 4:10 and 4:35, based on the temperature of the body and the very preliminary observations available to him at that moment. Constable Willoughby, recognizing the limitations of his authority in a matter of such apparent seriousness, placed telephone calls to the county constabulary and to Inspector Graves, a man known throughout the region for his methodical approach to investigation and his somewhat rigid adherence to procedure. The guests were ushered back into the garden, where they stood in clusters of uncomfortable proximity, speaking in the hushed tones reserved for matters of genuine tragedy. Yet Miss Marple, observing from a position near the rose garden where she had retired with a cup of tea that had grown cold and bitter during the interval, noted that the reactions varied considerably from the expected. Edward Thorne appeared genuinely shaken, his clerical composure stripped away to reveal an almost childlike distress. His wife, Constance, stood rigidly beside him, her hand upon his arm and her eyes fixed upon some distant point beyond the garden, as though she had deliberately removed her consciousness from the present moment. Timothy Ashworth sat upon one of the garden chairs, his face pale and his hands trembling with a violence that suggested shock rather than guilt, though Miss Marple had long since learned that such distinctions were rarely as clear as they appeared. Judith Makepeace sat beside him, her London composure seeming to dissolve into genuine concern, though whether that concern was for Timothy or for herself remained to be determined. The Hendersons presented a fascinating study in contrasts. David Henderson, the solicitor, maintained an expression of appropriate solemnity while his eyes moved constantly across the assembled guests, as though cataloguing their reactions with a precision that suggested professional habit. His wife, Vera, had positioned herself somewhat apart from the others, and her hand trembled as she lifted her teacup to her lips. When she noticed Miss Marple observing her, she looked away quickly, a gesture that might have indicated merely the natural embarrassment of being watched during a moment of distress, or something rather more complicated than that. Dr. Carruthers and David Brennan spoke quietly together, and Miss Marple wondered, with the particular interest that came from long observation of human nature, what conversation had previously passed between these two men that would now prompt such urgent, whispered consultation. Inspector Graves arrived at 5:30, accompanied by a sergeant and by a photographer whose equipment seemed both modern and somewhat intrusive in the context of violent death. The inspector was a man in his early 60s with the kind of face that had been shaped by methodical thinking and the accumulation of logical deductions. He examined the body with professional detachment, took careful note of the position of the crystal vase and its fragments, and then emerged into the garden with the air of someone preparing to conduct a business transaction rather than a murder investigation. His preliminary questioning was thorough, but followed a predictable pattern. Who had left the garden party? Only Martha, at approximately 4 o'clock. Who had been present at the time of her departure? All of the assembled guests. Had anyone else entered or left the house during the relevant period? Timothy Ashworth had discovered the body at approximately 4:30, which meant that the murder had occurred sometime during that half-hour window, when Martha was alone indoors and the guests remained upon the lawn. The inspector's logic was sound, and the conclusion seemed almost inevitable. The murderer was among them, had never left the garden, and had slipped away from the assembled group at some point during that fatal 30 minutes to commit an act of considerable violence. Inspector Graves requested that all present remain available for further questioning, and suggested, with the weight of his authority behind the suggestion, that no one should leave the village without explicit permission. He arranged for constables to be positioned at the entrance to the manor, and he began a more detailed examination of the sitting room where Martha had been discovered. It was during this examination that Miss Marple, standing quietly near the French doors with her handbag held primly before her, observed something that caused her expression to shift almost imperceptibly. Upon the mantelpiece, precisely where one of the crystal vases had resided, there now remained only the matching pair's surviving member. Yet beside it, on the dust-free surface of the marble, there remained the faint outline where the second vase had stood, an outline that suggested it had remained undisturbed for considerably longer than 30 minutes. Miss Marple said nothing, merely adjusted her spectacles and returned her attention to the assembled guests, each of whom seemed to be performing some private calculation regarding their own involvement or innocence in the matter at hand. The May afternoon had transformed entirely from garden party to crime scene, and the peaceful village, Miss Marple thought, would never quite be the same. By 6 o'clock, the village had begun to learn what had occurred at Thornfield Manor, and the news spread through St. Martin's with the inevitable velocity of all significant events in small communities where novelty was scarce and opportunity for speculation abundant. The telephony system, though hardly modern by the standards of larger towns, proved sufficient for the dissemination of information, and by the time evening settled across the village, nearly everyone of consequence knew that Martha Ashworth had been murdered, that the killer was almost certainly among those who had attended her garden party, and that Inspector Graves had established what amounted to a temporary headquarters in the drawing room of the manor itself. The village tea shop became the natural gathering point for those who wished to discuss the matter, and Miss Marple found herself, quite by accident and certainly not through any deliberate maneuvering on her part, seated at a small table with Mrs. Pemberton, the postmistress, and Mrs. Eleanor Cross, the wife of the village banker and the unofficial keeper of all gossip relating to matters financial or social. Mrs. Pemberton, a woman of considerable age and even more considerable experience in the sorting and delivery of other people's correspondence, leaned forward with the particular intensity of someone in possession of information that seemed relevant to the current crisis. "I shouldn't speak ill of the dead," she began, which was precisely the prelude that always preceded the most damaging comments. "But Martha Ashworth was hardly beloved by everyone in this village. There were tensions, you understand. Real tensions." Eleanor Cross, who possessed the kind of refined features that suggested breeding and the kind of sharp eyes that suggested she missed nothing of import, nodded in agreement. "Her relationship with Timothy had become quite strained," she offered. "I've heard from my husband, who has their financial affairs in his hands, that Martha had been threatening to alter her will. Apparently Timothy and that Judith creature have been planning rather expensive renovations to the cottage Martha had promised him, and Martha took offense at some matter or other." Miss Marple, who had been attending to her tea with apparent absorption, glanced up with an expression of innocent curiosity. "How very dreadful," she murmured. "But surely Timothy would not be so foolish as to commit such a terrible act. After all, if Martha had already decided to alter her will, the deed would be done, would it not? And if she had merely been threatening, well, threats often dissipate like morning mist once one removes the object of offense." Mrs. Pemberton exchanged a glance with Eleanor Cross that suggested they had not considered this particular logic. "There is that," the postmistress admitted reluctantly, "though the Thorn business is rather more complicated, I should think." She paused, seemingly uncertain whether to continue, but the appeal of sharing significant information proved too great to resist. The vicar and Martha had been at odds for some years regarding the restoration fund for the church. Martha had promised a substantial donation some 10 years ago, but she had steadily reduced the amount over time, always with some excuse or another. Edward Thorne was counting on that money rather desperately, or so I've heard from parishioners who speak to him in confidence, or who think they do at any rate. Eleanor Cross leaned back in her chair, assuming the air of one about to deliver a particularly significant revelation. But the real tension concerned Vera Henderson, she said quietly. Martha discovered something about Vera approximately 6 months ago. I don't know precisely what, but it caused a complete rupture in their friendship. They had been quite close before that, you understand, but afterwards Martha refused to speak to her, and Vera began referring to Martha in the most cutting terms whenever she thought no one was listening. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "How very curious," she observed. "And yet David Henderson is a solicitor, is he not? A man of considerable legal knowledge. If Martha had discovered something that might damage Vera, surely David would have taken steps to prevent Martha from acting upon that knowledge." The postmistress and the banker's wife fell silent, each apparently struck by this particular observation. The implications seemed to spread between them like ripples in water, each expanding upon and complicating the previous understanding. Eleanor Cross spoke slowly, as though the words were forming themselves in her mind rather than being summoned from some prepared reservoir. "There's also the matter of Dr. Carruthers," she said. "I happened to see him entering Martha's house on several occasions over the past few months. Always in the afternoon, always when Timothy was known to be away. I thought perhaps Martha was suffering from some medical complaint, but she never mentioned any illness, and when I asked her directly, she became quite evasive." Miss Marple considered this information with the kind of careful attention that suggested she was cataloguing it within some vast internal archive of human behavior and motivation. "A doctor calling upon a patient is hardly unusual," she observed mildly, "though I suppose the timing and the circumstances might lend themselves to speculation. And there is David Brennan to consider as well. I noticed that he and Dr. Carruthers seemed quite familiar with one another this afternoon, conversing as though they had matters of some importance to discuss. The revelation of another potential complication seemed to exhaust the immediate supply of gossip, though Miss Marple suspected, with a particular insight that came from decades of village observation, that there remained far more to be discovered. She finished her tea, thanked her companions for their informative conversation, and rose to depart, leaving behind 2 women who sat in contemplative silence, each apparently wrestling with the uncomfortable reality that the murder of Martha Ashworth had revealed far more secrets than anyone had anticipated, and that nearly everyone who had attended the garden party appeared to possess some motive, some tension, some hidden reason that might have prompted violent action against the deceased. The evening had settled fully across the village by the time Miss Marple reached her cottage, and the familiar comfort of her own sitting room seemed to offer a particular solace after the extraordinary events of the afternoon. She settled into her favorite chair, positioned precisely where she could observe the village street through the window while remaining herself obscured from external view, and allowed her mind to begin the process of organization that had served her so well throughout her years of accumulated experience. The facts, as she understood them, presented themselves in orderly fashion. Martha Ashworth had been murdered between 4:10 and 4:35 o'clock, during a period when she had been alone in her sitting room, and the guests had remained in the garden. The murder weapon was a crystal vase, one of a matching pair that had resided upon the mantelpiece, yet the vase that remained bore dust patterns suggesting it had been in place for considerably longer than the 30 minutes allotted for the crime. This discrepancy suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either the vase had been moved deliberately at some point prior to the murder, or it had not been the vase employed as a weapon at all. Miss Marple rose and retrieved her small leather notebook, the one in which she had long maintained observations regarding the behavior and habits of those in her acquaintance, and began to record the essential details with the precise handwriting that age had not diminished. Timothy Ashworth, the heir apparent, possessed obvious motive through inheritance and through Martha's threat to alter her will. Yet the discovery of the body seemed too immediate, too publicly conducted for someone genuinely guilty. A murderer possessed of both conscience and intelligence would surely have waited longer before raising the alarm, would have constructed some narrative of shock and surprise rather than presenting himself with blood still fresh upon the scene. Edward Thorne, the vicar, faced financial pressure regarding the church restoration, though Miss Marple wondered whether such matters, significant as they might be to a man of cloth, would truly drive him to violence. Constance Thorne remained largely unexplored in terms of motive, though there existed something in her rigidity, in the way she had positioned herself beside her husband like a protective barrier, that suggested she possessed knowledge or concerns that extended beyond mere social obligation. Vera Henderson represented an interesting study in consequences. If Martha had discovered something damaging about her, and if David Henderson possessed legal knowledge sufficient to recognize the threat, then the motivation for murder became considerably more substantial. Yet Vera's trembling hand and her averted gaze when Miss Marple observed her suggested distress rather than the calculated coldness that murder typically required. Dr. Carruthers presented perhaps the most intriguing puzzle. His visits to Thornfield Manor during daylight hours, while Timothy was absent, hinted at some relationship or arrangement that Martha had deemed worth keeping secret. What nature of consultation required such discretion? And what possible motive could extend from such meetings? David Brennan remained the most enigmatic figure. His recent arrival in the village, his consultation with Dr. Carruthers, his apparent lack of genuine connection to the deceased, all suggested that perhaps he was not the focal point, but rather a tangential figure whose presence at the garden party had been coincidental rather than intentional. Miss Marple set aside her notebook and gazed out the window toward the darkening street. The village had taken on an entirely different character since the murder. Lights burned in windows later than usual, and she could see clusters of people gathered on the pavement, engaged in urgent conversation. The rhythms of ordinary life had been disrupted entirely, replaced by the fevered speculation that accompanied violent death in a community where such events were virtually unheard of. A knock upon her door startled her from her contemplation, and she rose to find Constable Willoughby standing upon her threshold, looking somewhat embarrassed and considerably wearied by the events of the day. He requested her presence at Thornfield Manor the following morning at 10 o'clock, where Inspector Graves wished to conduct preliminary interviews with all who had attended the garden party. The constable apologized for the inconvenience, though his apology seemed perfunctory and offered out of habit rather than genuine conviction. After his departure, Miss Marple prepared herself for the evening with the methodical precision that had characterized her routine for decades. She prepared a simple supper, attended to her correspondence, and reviewed the local newspaper's account of previous crimes and misdemeanors, searching within its pages for any pattern or precedent that might illuminate the current situation. Sleep, when it finally came, proved restless and populated by dreams in which crystal vases multiplied and, reformed, in which voices whispered accusations in empty rooms, and in which Martha Ashworth appeared with an expression that seemed almost triumphant, as though her murder had validated some privately held belief about the corruption that lay beneath the surface of village life. Morning arrived with the inevitability that mornings possess, and Miss Marple dressed with particular care, selecting her clothing not for fashion but for the impression it would convey. The dress of a harmless, elderly woman, someone who could be observed without offense, spoken to without guard, and dismissed as insignificant once the conversation had concluded. She prepared a small basket containing her knitting, a gesture that would serve as both comfort and as a subtle reminder to anyone observing her that she was merely an old woman passing time during an unfortunate circumstance. The walk to Thornfield Manor took her through the village centre, and she observed that the news had thoroughly penetrated every corner of St. Martin's. Shopkeepers discussed the murder while attending to customers, and the postmistress had apparently already established herself as the primary source of information for those seeking details. By the time Miss Marple arrived at the manor gates, she found Inspector Graves already established in Martha's drawing room, with various members of the household and the garden party guests arriving in scheduled succession for their interviews. Inspector Graves had established a kind of temporary court within Martha's drawing room, where he sat behind the mahogany desk that had served Martha's purposes during her lifetime and now served his during the investigation. His sergeant occupied a chair in the corner, taking meticulous notes regarding every statement offered by those who filed through in response to the summons. The atmosphere was formal and deliberately intimidating, the kind of psychological environment designed to encourage candor through the weight of authority and the implicit suggestion that deception would be recognized and severely penalized. Timothy Ashworth was the first to be interviewed, and his session lasted nearly 40 minutes. When he emerged, his face bore the pallor of someone who had been subjected to intense questioning and who harbored considerable doubt regarding how his answers had been received. Judith Makepeace followed, and her interview proved somewhat briefer, suggesting either that her involvement was deemed less significant or that her answers satisfied the inspector more readily. Edward and Constance Thorne were interviewed separately, a decision that Miss Marple noted with particular interest as it suggested that Inspector Graves suspected some divergence between their accounts or their motivations. When Constance emerged, her composure seemed fractionally less absolute than it had appeared at the garden party, and her hands trembled slightly as she accepted a cup of tea that had been provided in the sitting room where the witnesses were being sequestered. By mid-morning, Miss Marple was invited into the presence of Inspector Graves, and she settled herself in the chair opposite his desk with the air of someone entirely at ease in formal settings. The inspector, who had apparently been briefed regarding the village's most prominent elderly resident, greeted her with the kind of courteous attention that suggested he recognized her as someone whose observations might prove valuable despite her apparent insignificance. "Miss Marple," he began, consulting a small notebook before him, "you attended yesterday's garden party and were present throughout the afternoon. I understand you remain in the garden even after the other guests had moved into the house following the discovery of the body." Miss Marple nodded gently. "I felt quite overcome," she explained, her voice carrying the slightly vague quality that often characterized her speech. "The shock, you understand. I preferred to remain outdoors in the fresh air, rather than venture inside where the dreadful business was occurring. I do so dislike being in the vicinity of unpleasantness." The inspector appeared to accept this explanation without skepticism. "Did you observe anyone leaving the garden or the immediate vicinity of the house at any point between 4 o'clock and 4:30 yesterday afternoon?" he asked. Miss Marple appeared to consider the question with great seriousness. "The garden was quite crowded," she said slowly, "and people were moving about in various directions. There was the croquet game, which seemed to be generating considerable excitement. I confess I was not paying close attention to the precise movements of each individual, though I do recall noticing that Dr. Carruthers and Mr. Brennan seemed to be engaged in quite urgent conversation for much of the time. They were standing near the rose garden, I believe, and they seemed rather focused upon their discussion to pay attention to the social pleasantries." The inspector made a note of this observation, and Miss Marple continued with apparent thoughtfulness. "I also noticed that Mrs. Vera Henderson seemed quite distressed throughout the afternoon. She was not her usual self, if I might be so bold as to suggest such a thing. Her hand was trembling when she held her teacup." Inspector Graves pressed further, asking Miss Marple to describe in detail the precise arrangement of the garden and the positions of the various guests during the critical period. She provided this information with a kind of meticulous care that suggested she had made precise mental note of everything she observed, though her demeanor remained that of a woman merely making casual conversation rather than engaged in something as significant as a murder investigation. When the inspector asked whether she had noticed anything unusual within the sitting room or its furnishings, Miss Marple paused, and her eyes seemed to focus with particular intensity despite the vagueness that characterized her normal presentation. "The mantelpiece," she said quietly. "There was a pair of crystal vases, was there not? matching vases. I noticed that one seemed to have been removed quite recently, as the dust pattern suggested, though I confess I may have been mistaken, as I was not paying close attention to such domestic arrangements. The inspector's expression sharpened considerably. He rose and walked to the sitting room where the body had been discovered, and Miss Marple, having been invited to accompany him, pointed out the precise dust pattern she had observed. Inspector Graves examined it with growing interest, then turned to his sergeant and instructed him to photograph the mantelpiece and make detailed measurements of the remaining vase and the space where its twin had stood. "You have a remarkably observant eye, Miss Marple," he said, returning to the drawing room with a new intensity in his expression. "Tell me, did you observe anything else that seemed to you unusual or worthy of note?" Miss Marple settled herself in her chair once more, her hands folded upon her knitting. "Nothing specific," she said, "though I have lived in this village for a considerable time, and I have come to understand that human nature often reveals itself in the smallest of gestures and habits. Martha Ashworth seemed yesterday to be someone who wished very much to reveal something that she had been keeping secret. There was a quality of anticipation to her manner, as though she was about to accomplish some significant objective. It seemed almost as though her guests were not truly guests at all, but rather an audience assembled for a particular performance." The inspector studied her carefully, and Miss Marple's expression remained entirely innocent and slightly vague, as though she had merely been making idle observations about matters that were really of very little consequence. Yet her words had clearly struck some significant chord in his understanding, and when she was eventually excused from the interview and returned to the sitting room where the other witnesses waited, it was with the knowledge that she had introduced a new element into the investigation, one that Inspector Graves would be forced to consider and that might, if she had calculated correctly, guide his thinking toward the actual solution rather than toward the convenient suspect that circumstances seemed to suggest. The afternoon interviews continued with methodical precision, each suspect presenting themselves to Inspector Graves with varying degrees of composure and apparent cooperation. Dr. Carruthers occupied the inspector's attention for considerably longer than the other guests, emerging with an expression that suggested he had been subjected to questioning of particular intensity. Miss Marple, observing from her position in the sitting room where the witnesses were confined, noted the way his hands trembled slightly as he accepted a glass of water from the maid, and the way his eyes avoided direct contact with any of the other assembled individuals. When David Henderson was called for his interview, he entered the drawing room with the bearing of a man accustomed to navigating difficult legal terrain, and his emergence some 30 minutes later suggested that his training and experience had served him well in deflecting or satisfying the inspector's inquiries. Yet, when he returned to the sitting room, his wife Vera rose immediately, her face exhibiting the kind of intense concern that suggested their relationship, whatever its other complications, was not characterized by indifference. David Brennan's interview proved brief and seemingly unsatisfactory to Inspector Graves, who emerged to consult briefly with his sergeant before calling Vera Henderson forward. Her session lasted approximately 45 minutes, and when she finally returned to the sitting room, her composure had deteriorated noticeably. She sat rigidly in her chair, her handbag clutched tightly upon her lap, and she refused the tea that was offered to her. Miss Marple, who had settled herself quietly in a corner with her knitting, observed all of this with the particular attention that characterized her approach to human behavior. By late afternoon, with the interviews essentially concluded, Inspector Graves reconvened the assembled witnesses in the drawing room. He stood before them with the air of someone whose investigation had revealed complications rather than clarifications, and his expression suggested that the simple narrative of an heir murdering his elderly grandmother for inheritance had become considerably more complex. "I have received some additional information," he announced, "that requires clarification from several of you. It has come to my attention that Martha Ashworth had been engaged in various activities during the weeks and months preceding her death that suggest her relationship with several of you was considerably more complicated than initial accounts have indicated. He paused, allowing this observation to settle among the assembled suspects like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples of tension and apprehension. "Dr. Carruthers, you have stated that your visits to Thornfield Manor were purely of a medical nature, related to a persistent condition from which Mrs. Ashworth was suffering. Yet I have been unable to locate any medical records documenting such a condition, nor have I found any prescription medications in Mrs. Ashworth's possession that would suggest ongoing treatment. Perhaps you might clarify the nature of these visits." Dr. Carruthers appeared to wrestle with himself, his face flushing with evident discomfort. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "Martha was not unwell physically," he said quietly. "She had summoned me regarding a matter of considerable delicacy. Several months ago, she discovered that she possessed a previously unknown grandchild, a child born out of wedlock many years ago, prior to her own marriage. She was attempting to locate this individual and wished my assistance as I maintain various professional connections throughout the region." The revelation hung in the air like a suspended blade, and the expressions of shock that rippled through the assembled witnesses suggested that this information had not been previously known. Timothy Ashworth's face paled considerably, and Judith Makepeace placed her hand upon his arm in a gesture of support that seemed to transcend their engagement and suggest something deeper. Inspector Graves pressed forward with his questioning. "And David Brennan," he said, turning his attention to the agricultural consultant. "Your presence at yesterday's garden party was rather curious, given that you had only recently arrived in the village. How did you become acquainted with Mrs. Ashworth?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and the brief glance he exchanged with Dr. Carruthers suggested some prior arrangement regarding this revelation. "Martha Ashworth was my mother," he said quietly. "I had only recently made contact with Dr. Carruthers, who had been assisting her in locating me. She had requested my presence at the garden party so that she might introduce me to the family, though she had not yet informed Timothy of my existence." The shock of this revelation produced a visible reaction throughout the room. Timothy Ashworth appeared genuinely stunned, as though the discovery of an unknown uncle presented him with complications extending far beyond mere inheritance concerns. Edward Thorne had begun to perspire, quite visibly, and his wife Constance's hand gripped his arm with what appeared to be considerable force. Inspector Graves consulted his notebook once more. "It would appear," he said slowly, "that Mrs. Ashworth had been conducting various investigations and manipulations regarding inheritance and family matters that were likely to prove extremely complicated and potentially disastrous for several individuals present in this room. She had been preparing to make significant revelations yesterday, revelations that would have altered substantially the expectations and arrangements that several of you had established. This raises the question of motive considerably beyond the simple matter of inheritance." He paused, allowing the implications to settle. "However, it does not immediately clarify which of you possessed sufficient desperation or rage to commit this particular crime. Therefore, I'm requesting that you all remain available in the village pending further investigation. I intend to examine Mrs. Ashworth's personal papers, her correspondence, and her financial records in considerable detail. I suspect that what emerges will reveal a far more complex network of motivation than has thus far become apparent." As the witnesses were dismissed and allowed to depart Thornfield Manor, Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her knitting still in her lap, her expression thoughtful and contemplative. Inspector Graves approached her before her departure and regarded her with an expression that suggested he was attempting to calculate whether her earlier observations regarding the dust patterns on the mantelpiece had been coincidental or whether she possessed some deeper understanding of the matter that she had not yet revealed. Inspector Graves accompanied Miss Marple to the door of Thornfield Manor, and his demeanor suggested that despite her harmless appearance, he had begun to recognize her as someone whose observations extended beyond the superficial and whose understanding of human motivation might prove valuable to his investigation. "Miss Marple," he said as they reached the threshold, I find myself in possession of considerable information that complicates rather than clarifies this matter. Perhaps you might walk with me through the gardens for a moment. I would value your perspective, given your long residence in this village and your evident acquaintance with its inhabitants. Miss Marple accepted this invitation with apparent pleasure, and the two proceeded through the formal gardens toward the rose beds where, only yesterday, guests had attempted to engage in croquet with considerable competitive intensity. The evening light cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and the flowers seemed to glow with an almost supernatural brilliance in the fading day. Inspector Graves spoke as they walked, his tone reflecting genuine intellectual engagement rather than mere courtesy. "What strikes me most forcefully," he said, "is the question of timing and psychology. Martha Ashworth invited these particular people to her garden party on this particular day, apparently with the intention of revealing information that would fundamentally alter the expectations and relationships of her family. Yet that revelation never occurred, because she was murdered sometime between 4 and 4:30 before she could divulge her secrets. The question becomes, did someone murder her to prevent that revelation, or was the murder entirely unrelated to whatever she had planned to disclose?" Miss Marple paused beside a bed of particularly magnificent roses, and her fingers traced the air near their petals without actually touching them. "In my experience, Inspector," she said quietly, "human nature rarely operates according to the logical patterns that investigations prefer to follow. People commit acts of violence not always from calculated premeditation, but from moment of passion, from sudden realization, from reactions that seem entirely disproportionate to their cause when examined in retrospect. Martha Ashworth had arranged this garden party specifically to control a narrative, to present information in a manner that allowed her to manage the reactions of those involved. That itself is a form of manipulation, is it not? And manipulation of that particular sort often generates resentments that accumulate beneath the surface like pressure building within a sealed vessel." The inspector stopped walking and turned to face her directly. "You are suggesting that someone reacted violently to the manipulation itself, not necessarily to the specific information that was to be revealed?" Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "I'm suggesting only that motivations are frequently far more complex than they initially appear. Now, regarding the crystal vase that was used as the murder weapon, I observed that its twin bore dust patterns, suggesting it had resided undisturbed for considerably longer than 30 minutes. This suggests either that the weapon was not actually the vase that lay shattered, or that the second vase had been removed from the mantelpiece at some point prior to yesterday's events." Inspector Graves walked forward slowly, his mind clearly engaging with this observation. "You believe the weapon was brought into the house deliberately, brought by someone in attendance at the garden party?" Miss Marple followed him across the lawn, her aged form moving with surprising steadiness. "I believe," she said, "that one must consider the question of whether any of those present at the garden party actually left the garden at any point during the critical 30 minutes. You have stated that all remained in the garden. Yet human memory is frequently unreliable, and the attention of a group of people engaged in social activity is rarely focused upon the precise location of every individual at every moment. If someone had slipped away and returned, would they have been noticed?" Inspector Graves fell silent, apparently wrestling with this particular suggestion. They had returned to the house by this point, and he stood upon the threshold, looking back toward the gardens where the crime had occurred. "There is one matter that troubles me considerably," he said finally. "David Brennan claims that Martha Ashworth summoned him to the garden party in order to introduce him to the family as her previously unknown son. Yet his presence at the garden party was mentioned by several witnesses as being somewhat unexpected and unexplained. If Martha had deliberately invited him, why did she not simply explain his presence to the assembled guests when he arrived?" Miss Marple's expression suggested that she had been anticipating precisely this observation. "An excellent question," she acknowledged, One that suggests Martha had not yet decided how to present Mr. Brennan's existence, or that the circumstances surrounding his arrival at the garden party were rather more complicated than his current account suggests. Dr. Carruthers corroborated his story regarding Martha's search for her unknown child. Yet one must ask whether Dr. Carruthers possessed complete and accurate information regarding Martha's intentions, or whether he was himself being manipulated by Martha's presentation of events. The inspector regarded Miss Marple with an expression suggesting he was beginning to perceive the depths of complication that underlay the apparently simple matter of an elderly woman murdered at her own garden party. "What you are suggesting," he said slowly, "is that nearly everyone present may have been operating under false assumptions regarding Martha's intentions and the true nature of the gathering." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am suggesting only that Martha Ashworth was a woman who had accumulated considerable knowledge about the private affairs and hidden secrets of those around her. Such women are frequently in possession of more power than is immediately apparent, and such power creates opportunities for complicated emotional reactions. Whether those reactions extended to violence, I cannot presume to say. That determination remains your responsibility, Inspector." As Miss Marple departed Thornfield Manor and walked back through the village toward her cottage, she was aware that she had introduced a significant complication into Inspector Graves' investigation. Yet she had done so in a manner that raised questions rather than provided answers, that complicated rather than clarified, that suggested avenues of inquiry rather than directing him toward conclusions. It was the method that had served her well throughout her years of involvement in village mysteries, and she suspected that it would serve her well in this matter as well, though the path to truth seemed considerably more labyrinthine than the surface events had initially suggested. The next morning brought with it a development that seemed to confirm Miss Marple's suspicion that the investigation had become considerably more complicated than the initial circumstances had suggested. Inspector Graves's team, having obtained a warrant to examine Martha Ashworth's personal papers and correspondence, discovered an extensive collection of documents that painted a portrait of a woman engaged in detailed investigation into the private affairs of nearly everyone in her social circle. There were letters from solicitors regarding property transfers, correspondence with financial advisors regarding investments and inheritance arrangements, and most significantly, a series of handwritten notes in Martha's distinctive script that documented her discoveries regarding the various secrets and indiscretions of those she had known for decades. The discovery of these documents led to the revelation that Martha had been aware of Edward Thorne's financial difficulties and his desperate attempts to secure funding for the church restoration through methods that bordered on ecclesiastical impropriety. She had discovered that Constance Thorne had been in communication with a gentleman in London who was decidedly not her husband, correspondence that suggested romantic entanglement of considerable impropriety. She had learned that David Henderson's legal practice had been plagued by accusations of unethical conduct, though the cases had been quietly settled and suppressed through the intervention of powerful connections. She had uncovered evidence that Vera Henderson had been embezzling funds from various charitable organizations with which she was affiliated, a theft that would have resulted in criminal prosecution had it been discovered through official channels. Yet the most damning discovery concerned David Brennan. Martha's notes revealed that she had indeed located her unknown son, but that his arrival in the village and his apparent consultation with Dr. Carruthers had not been entirely voluntary or innocent. Brennan had been working as a private investigator, hired by parties unknown to conduct surveillance and gather information regarding various matters in the village, though the notes did not specify precisely who had employed him or what particular matters formed the focus of his investigation. This revelation cast significant doubt upon his account of events and suggested that his presence at the garden party may have been considerably more calculated than his initial story had indicated. Inspector Graves, armed with these discoveries, requested that all the suspects return to Thornfield Manor for further questioning. This time, however, the tone of the interviews shifted considerably. The inspector was no longer attempting to determine whether a crime had been committed. He was now attempting to determine which of these individuals, each of whom possessed considerable motive and opportunity, had actually committed it. Timothy Ashworth was interrogated regarding his knowledge of his grandmother's discoveries and his understanding of how those discoveries might have affected his expectations regarding his inheritance. Judith Makepeace was questioned about her possible role in encouraging Timothy to act if his inheritance appeared threatened. Edward and Constance Thorne were pressed regarding their willingness to commit violence to prevent their secrets from becoming public knowledge. David and Vera Henderson were confronted with the evidence of Vera's embezzlement and questioned regarding whether Martha had threatened to expose her criminal activities. Dr. Caruthers was interrogated about the true nature of his relationship with Martha and whether he had served as her agent in gathering information regarding the other villagers. David Brennan was questioned extensively about his employment as an investigator, about who had hired him, and about what precise role he was meant to perform in the village. Throughout all of this interrogation and revelation, Miss Marple observed from her position as an elderly witness of minimal apparent significance. She attended each day's proceedings, settled herself with her knitting in the corner of the sitting room, and listened to the testimony and counter-testimony with an expression of gentle interest that gave no indication of the careful analysis occurring within her mind. On the third day of intensified investigation, Inspector Graves seemed to reach a point of considerable frustration. Each suspect possessed motive, each had opportunity, each had demonstrated willingness to act in their own self-interest, and yet none had confessed, none had demonstrated obvious guilt, and the physical evidence remained ambiguous. The crystal vase that had been used as the murder weapon bore no clear fingerprints. The timing of the crime allowed for multiple possibilities regarding who might have committed it, and the psychological profiles of the suspects were sufficiently complex to permit multiple interpretations. It was late afternoon when Inspector Graves approached Miss Marple in the sitting room and requested that she join him in Martha's study, a room that had not yet been thoroughly examined during the previous day's activities. Once they were alone, he closed the door and turned to her with an expression suggesting that he had reached the limits of conventional investigation and was prepared to acknowledge a form of expertise that extended beyond the merely official. "Miss Marple," he said, his tone suggesting both frustration and genuine intellectual humility, "I've been engaged in police investigation for nearly 4 decades. I've interviewed hundreds of suspects, examined thousands of crime scenes, and I pride myself on my ability to discern truth from falsehood through the application of logical analysis and careful observation. Yet in this matter, I find myself increasingly uncertain. You have lived in this village for considerably longer than I have walked upon this earth. You have known these people across decades, and you possess an understanding of human nature that seems to extend beyond the merely observational. I'm asking you directly, who murdered Martha Ashworth?" Miss Marple settled herself in one of Martha's chairs with the air of someone who had been expecting this precise question and who possessed a considered response prepared well in advance. She folded her hands upon her knitting and regarded the inspector with eyes that seemed suddenly far less vague and considerably more focused than she typically allowed them to appear. "Before I answer that question," she said quietly, "I must ask you whether you have examined the study itself with particular attention to detail. Martha maintained her personal papers and her most significant discoveries in this room, did she not? And if someone wished to destroy evidence of their involvement in her schemes and investigations, they would have needed access to this room prior to the body being discovered and the investigation commencing." Inspector Graves rose immediately and began to examine the study with renewed attention, his eyes moving across the mahogany bookshelves, the filing cabinets, and the substantial desk where Martha had apparently conducted her investigations into the affairs of others. Miss Marple rose and walked to a particular section of the bookshelf, her aged fingers tracing the spines of the volumes with apparent randomness. Yet when she withdrew one particular book, a leather-bound volume of Tennyson's poetry that seemed incongruous among Martha's collection of financial ledgers and business correspondence. She revealed a small space behind it. Within that space lay several documents that had apparently been deliberately hidden, and their discovery seemed to cause Inspector Graves to draw in his breath with considerable force. The documents consisted of correspondence between Martha Ashworth and a solicitor in a neighboring county. Correspondence that detailed the preparation of an entirely new will, one that would have fundamentally altered the inheritance structure of Martha's considerable estate. According to this proposed will, approximately 30% of Martha's assets were to be directed toward establishing a trust fund for David Brennan, her previously unknown son. The remaining 70% was to be divided equally between Timothy Ashworth and a charitable foundation dedicated to supporting children born outside of matrimony, a foundation that would have been established in Martha's name and would have perpetuated her legacy through the support of individuals in circumstances similar to those of her own illegitimate child. Furthermore, the documents revealed that Martha had prepared detailed instructions regarding how her various secrets were to be revealed to those affected. Timothy was to learn of his uncle and of the significant reduction in his anticipated inheritance. Edward Thorne was to be informed that unless he ceased his questionable financial practices and submitted himself to ecclesiastical discipline, Martha would personally expose his conduct to the bishop and to the parishioners of his church. Vera Henderson was to be confronted with evidence of her embezzlement and given an ultimatum. Either she would voluntarily confess her crimes and submit to appropriate legal consequences, or Martha would ensure that her criminal activities became public knowledge through the most damaging possible means. David Henderson was to be informed that his wife's criminal activities would be exposed unless he agreed to use his legal expertise to assist Martha in establishing the charitable foundation and ensuring that all matters were conducted with impeccable legality. "This changes everything," Inspector Graves murmured, his eyes moving across the documents with intense focus. Martha did not merely possess knowledge of these secrets. She intended to weaponize them. She intended to control the actions and futures of these people through the threat of exposure. Miss Marple settled herself once more in Martha's chair, her expression remaining thoughtful and contemplative. "Indeed," she said quietly, Martha Ashworth was a woman who had accumulated power through the acquisition of secrets, and she intended to exercise that power in a manner that would satisfy her own moral judgments regarding the appropriate behavior of others. She was, in essence, attempting to orchestrate the moral reformation of her entire social circle through the application of controlled revelation and psychological coercion. Such an approach generates profound resentment, Inspector. It generates the kind of rage that lies beneath politeness and propriety, the kind of desperate anger that can drive ordinary people to extraordinary violence. Inspector Graves turned to her with sudden comprehension in his expression. "You are saying that someone murdered her, not in a moment of panic upon discovering their secrets had been exposed, but in a calculated response to the discovery of her intentions. Someone discovered these documents or learned of Martha's plans and murdered her to prevent the revelations from occurring." Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "I am suggesting that you consider carefully the precise timing of events. Martha had prepared these documents and arranged this new will with the assistance of a solicitor in another county, an individual whose discretion was presumably assured through professional obligation. Yet such matters are rarely entirely secret. Someone may have learned of Martha's intentions through indirect means. Someone may have discovered evidence of her intentions within this study itself. And someone may have realized that the garden party represented the moment when Martha intended to begin her orchestrated revelations." The inspector walked to the desk and examined it carefully, his fingers tracing the surface of the wood. "The study door was locked," he said slowly. "But the key was kept on Martha's person, which means she must have gone to the study at some point during the afternoon to retrieve something or to make a final notation. The murderer may have followed her here, may have confronted her regarding her intentions, and may have committed the crime here rather than in the sitting room where the body was found. Miss Marple rose and walked to the large Persian rug that dominated the floor of the study. Beside it lay a smaller rug, and she gestured toward the space where the smaller rug had apparently been recently displaced. "The body was moved," she said with certainty. "Martha was murdered here, in her study, where she had come to make some final preparation for her garden party revelations. The murderer then dragged her body to the sitting room, where it would be discovered in a more public location, where the crime would appear more impulsive and less calculated. The murderer sought to transform an act of calculated premeditation into an appearance of momentary passion." Inspector Graves's expression hardened with resolve. "Then we must determine which of these suspects possessed sufficient knowledge of Martha's intentions to act upon them before the garden party commenced. Which of them would have had access to the study? Which of them would have been capable of carrying Martha's body from this room to the sitting room?" He paused, and his eyes focused upon Miss Marple with singular intensity. "But before I conduct further interrogation based on this new information, I must ask you directly, Miss Marple. Who among the suspects do you believe committed this crime? Who possessed the particular combination of knowledge, motive, opportunity, and psychological capacity to commit this act?" Miss Marple walked to the window and gazed out toward the gardens where, just 3 days previous, a woman had attempted to orchestrate the moral reformation of her entire social circle. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried the absolute certainty of someone who had analyzed human nature across decades and arrived at conclusions that could not be contradicted. "It was Constance Thorne," Miss Marple said quietly, her gaze remaining fixed upon the gardens beyond the window. "Not Timothy Ashworth, despite the obvious motive of inheritance. Not Vera Henderson, despite the criminal exposure that Martha threatened. Not even Edward Thorne, though his financial difficulties and moral compromises provided sufficient justification. It was Constance, and her motive was far more profound and far more personal than any of the surface considerations that have thus far dominated the investigation." Inspector Graves stepped forward, his expression suggesting both skepticism and the recognition that Miss Marple's analysis might indeed illuminate aspects of the crime that had previously remained obscure. "Explain," he commanded, and Miss Marple turned from the window to face him directly, her aged features suddenly appearing far more forceful and penetrating than they typically did. "Constance Thorne devoted her entire adult life to the construction of a particular social identity," Miss Marple began, settling herself in Martha's chair with the air of someone about to deliver conclusions reached through decades of careful observation. "She was not born to wealth or to significant social position. She married Edward Thorne when he was merely an assistant curate with modest prospects and considerable debts. Through her own efforts, through careful manipulation of social circumstances, and through ruthless advancement of her husband's ecclesiastical career, she transformed herself from a woman of ordinary background into the wife of a village vicar and a person of genuine social consequence within this community. That identity, Inspector, was everything to her. It represented her validation, her vindication, her entire sense of self-worth." The inspector listened without interruption, his keen mind apparently engaging with the implications that Miss Marple was articulating. "Martha Ashworth," Miss Marple continued, "possessed knowledge of Constance's private correspondence with a gentleman in London. Yet that knowledge represented merely the surface of a far more complex and dangerous situation. Constance had been engaged in a prolonged emotional attachment that threatened not merely her marriage, but her entire social position. An affair might be forgiven within certain circumstances, might be managed through discretion and careful social navigation. But Martha did not intend to allow Constance to manage the situation. Martha intended to expose it, to publicly humiliate her, to orchestrate her moral reformation through the application of shame and social destruction." Miss Marple paused, allowing the inspector to absorb the psychological dimensions of what she was articulating. "You see," she said, "Constance Thorne had spent decades constructing a social identity that was entirely dependent upon her position as the vicar's wife, as a woman of propriety and moral rectitude. That identity was not authentic. It was a performance maintained through constant vigilance and careful control. Martha Ashworth threatened to demolish that performance entirely. She threatened to expose Constance not merely as an adulteress, but as a fraud, as a woman whose entire social position was built upon false foundations. For a woman like Constance, such a threat represented not merely scandal, but existential annihilation." Inspector Graves moved to the desk and seated himself, his fingers steepled before him as he considered the psychological analysis that Miss Marple had presented. How could Constance have known about Martha's intentions? He asked. How would she have discovered the documents or learned of Martha's plans for the garden party revelations? Miss Marple's expression suggested she had anticipated this precise question. "Constance is a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable cunning," she said. She noticed that Martha had been behaving differently in recent weeks, that Martha possessed a quality of anticipation and controlled excitement that suggested she was planning something significant. When Martha summoned everyone to the garden party on this particular afternoon, Constance may have suspected that Martha intended to reveal something damaging. She may have confronted Martha, demanding to know what Martha had discovered. Martha, being a woman who enjoyed the exercise of power through the revelation of secrets, may have provided sufficient details to make clear her intentions. Miss Marple rose and walked to a small escritoire that sat beside Martha's desk. Opening one of its drawers, she withdrew a letter that appeared to be in the process of composition, its final sentences still unfinished. "This letter," she said, showing it to Inspector Graves, "appears to be a draft of correspondence that Martha was preparing to send to Constance. It outlines Martha's discoveries regarding her relationship with the gentleman in London. It describes Martha's intention to speak with Edward regarding the matter. It explains Martha's expectation that Constance would confess her indiscretions and submit herself to appropriate moral discipline. In short, it represents a threat of systematic destruction of everything Constance has built across decades of careful manipulation." Inspector Graves examined the letter, and understanding seemed to crystallize in his expression. "Constance came to the study," he said slowly, "confronted Martha regarding this letter or regarding Martha's intentions. An argument ensued. In a moment of desperation, Constance seized the crystal vase that Martha kept upon her desk, a vase that had been moved from the mantelpiece and placed in the study for some reason we have yet to determine, and struck Martha with it. The blow was immediate, violent, driven by the psychological desperation of a woman whose entire identity was threatened with annihilation." Miss Marple nodded gently. Constance then realized what she had done. Rather than leave the body in the study where discovery might suggest premeditation, she dragged Martha to the sitting room. She attempted to arrange the circumstances in such a way as to suggest that the crime was impulsive rather than calculated, an act of momentary violence rather than deliberate intention. She then returned to the garden and positioned herself beside her husband, attempting to behave as though nothing had occurred, hoping that the discovery of the body would be attributed to Timothy or to some other suspect whose motives were more obviously financial. Inspector Graves rose from his chair with the bearing of a man who had finally achieved the clarity that his investigation had been seeking. "We must bring her in for formal interrogation," he said. "We must confront her with this evidence and with the psychological analysis that your observations have revealed." Yet as he moved toward the study door, Miss Marple's voice stopped him. "Before you do," she said gently, "you might consider that Constance Thorne is a woman who has devoted her entire adult life to the construction and maintenance of a carefully choreographed social performance. When confronted with the complete demolition of that performance through legal consequences and public exposure, she may not respond with the kind of acceptance that one might hope for. A woman whose entire identity has been based upon control and upon the manipulation of appearances may experience that loss of control as a form of psychological dissolution that makes her capable of further desperate acts. Inspector Graves acknowledged Miss Marple's warning with a grave nod, and he proceeded with considerably more caution than he might otherwise have exercised. He arranged for constables to be stationed discreetly near the vicarage, and instructed his sergeant to remain alert for any indication that Constance Thorne might attempt to flee or to harm herself. The formal summons for Constance to return to Thornfield Manor for further questioning was delivered by telephone to Edward Thorne, who expressed confusion regarding why his wife should be required to undergo additional interrogation when their initial interviews had already been completed. Inspector Graves offered no explanation beyond the polite insistence that her presence was necessary and that the matter was of considerable urgency. Within the hour, Constance Thorne arrived at Thornfield Manor, her composure seemingly intact, yet exhibiting the kind of carefully maintained rigidity that suggested significant psychological strain. She was escorted to the study where Inspector Graves had arranged to conduct the interrogation, and Miss Marple, with the inspector's permission, remained present though positioned in a manner that placed her outside Constance's direct line of sight. Inspector Graves began with careful precision, outlining the evidence that his investigation had uncovered regarding the location where Martha had been murdered, and the psychological profile that suggested the perpetrator was someone whose entire social identity had been threatened by Martha's intentions. He spoke without accusation initially, merely presenting facts and observations, allowing Constance the opportunity to respond and to provide explanations for the evidence that was being presented. Yet as the weight of accumulating detail became apparent, Constance's composure began to fracture. Her hands trembled, her breathing became shallow and rapid. Her eyes moved constantly between the inspector and the study door, as though calculating possibilities for escape or evasion. When Inspector Graves finally presented the draft letter that Martha had been composing to Constance, and when he outlined the clear evidence of premeditation and of Martha's intention to expose Constance's private correspondence and emotional attachments, something seemed to break within her psychological defenses. She rose from her chair with sudden violence, and for a moment it appeared that she might attempt to flee. Yet instead, she walked to the window and stood gazing out toward the gardens with an expression of such profound despair that even Inspector Graves seemed momentarily moved by the depth of her distress. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible, reduced to a whisper by the weight of emotion that she could no longer contain. "You don't understand," she said, her gaze remaining fixed upon the distant landscape. "You cannot possibly understand what it meant to construct something from nothing, to transform oneself entirely through will and determination and careful manipulation of every social circumstance. I was nothing, Inspector. I was the daughter of a clerk, without connections, without wealth, without anything to distinguish me from the millions of ordinary women who would live and die, without ever mattering to anyone or anything. And then I married Edward, and I began to build. I built a position. I built respect. I built a life that mattered." She turned from the window, and her face was streaked with tears, yet her expression carried an almost defiant quality, as though she was determined to have her motivations and her achievements acknowledged before she surrendered to the consequences of her actions. "Martha Ashworth had watched me build all of this," Constance continued, her voice growing stronger with the release of long-suppressed emotion. "She had observed my transformation from a woman of no consequence into someone of genuine social standing. And she was jealous, Inspector. She was jealous of my achievement, jealous of my success, jealous that I had accomplished through intelligence and determination what she herself could never accomplish through merely being born wealthy and well-connected. When she discovered my correspondence with James, she saw an opportunity to destroy everything I had built, to drag me down into scandal and shame and social annihilation." Inspector Graves intervened with quiet authority. "Yet you murdered her," he said simply. You struck her with the crystal vase. You dragged her body to the sitting room. You attempted to conceal your crime and to direct suspicion toward your stepson. Constance's expression hardened, and she returned to her chair, her body seeming to collapse inward as though the physical confession had depleted whatever psychological resources had sustained her through recent days. "Yes," she said simply. "I murdered her. When I discovered the draft letter, when I understood what she intended to do, I felt something break inside me. All those years of construction, all that careful building about to be demolished by a woman who had never worked for anything in her entire life. I confronted her in the study. I demanded that she destroy the letters, that she abandon her intention to reveal my private affairs. She refused. She laughed at me. She said that my destruction was exactly what I deserved, that my entire social position was nothing but a fraud that required demolition. And I seized the vase, and I struck her, and I struck her again, and I could not stop striking her until she was silent." Inspector Graves rose and placed his hand upon Constance's arm, reading her rights and explaining that she would be formally charged with the murder of Martha Ashworth. Constance did not resist. She seemed almost relieved, as though the revelation of truth and the cessation of the elaborate performance that had characterized her existence represented a form of release rather than a punishment. As she was led away by constables toward the waiting vehicle that would transport her to the county jail, Miss Marple remained in the study, her expression thoughtful and profoundly sad. Inspector Graves returned to where she stood and extended his hand in acknowledgement of her role in resolving what had become an extraordinarily complicated investigation. "You perceived what I could not," he said simply. "You understood human nature in a manner that transcended the merely observational. How did you know with such certainty that it was Constance Thorne?" Miss Marple accepted his hand gently, and her aged eyes seemed to reflect the accumulated wisdom of decades spent observing the patterns of human behavior and motivation. "Because," she said quietly, "I've spent my entire life understanding the particular desperation that accompanies the construction and maintenance of false identities. I've watched women and men build elaborate performances to conceal their true natures and their genuine circumstances. And I have come to recognize that when such carefully constructed performances face destruction, the individuals who have devoted their lives to maintaining those performances are capable of violence that seems entirely disproportionate to the external circumstances, but is entirely logical when understood from within the psychology of someone who perceives their entire identity as being under threat. Constance Thorne committed murder not in a moment of impulsive passion, but as an act of desperate self-preservation, attempting to prevent the annihilation of everything she believed herself to be.